we're seeing the AI industry kind of facing what some are calling kind of a significant disconnect between the massive investments in AI companies and technology and then the actual economic impact. So we're seeing a few stories that are getting a lot of popularity talking about this idea. So first up, David Kahn at Sequoia Capital, a major VC firm, has actually updated an existing analysis that he does on the AI industry's revenue expectations. So this was an article that was originally published in September 2023 titled AI's $200 billion question. The update, the new analysis, is titled AI's $600 billion question. And it basically reveals that there's this big gap between AI infrastructure investments and the actual revenue growth happening in the AI ecosystem. He is saying that based on his numbers, the revenue gap has grown significantly from essentially a $125 billion hole, i.e., what revenue kind of needs to be made up to annually to justify the current capital expenditures. That is increased to a $500 billion hole that needs to be filled by revenue growth. Meanwhile, at the same time, we were reading kind of an in-depth report on the same idea, the disconnect between the hype and around AI and its actual economic impact in The Economist. And what's really interesting is their reporting is saying that many companies are still experimenting with AI or hesitant to kind of invest in it heavily, and that so far there's little evidence of AI boosting productivity or transforming businesses on a large scale. Now, as part of that reporting, they cite a pretty interesting report from the US Census Bureau that claims AI adoption rates based on a bunch of their survey data remains surprisingly low. The Bureau reports that only 5.4% of businesses in their books are currently using AI, and that's as of February 2024. They do project that number to raise a bit, about a percentage point by the fall, but still it's pretty low based on kind of what we've been talking about. So, Paul, I want to kind of maybe dive in to this topic from a couple angles. So, like, what do you make of the overall disconnect here that people are reporting? I mean, Sequoia is reporting this huge $500 billion hole, even despite companies like OpenAI making up to now $3 billion annually. It just seems like there's this huge gap. Maybe the census report you could touch on just with this seems very low for the adoption rates here. Like, what are you making of these kind of findings and commentary?
Yeah, I wasn't sure on the Sequoia one initially. Like, I wasn't sure I was buying the premise when I first read it, and then I went
Mhm.
back and read the original post, so the 200 billion one, where the argument was made a little more clearly, I think, or at least the foundation of the argument was made. And so the basic premise of the Sequoia one, which I generally agree with, they're actually looking at how much money is being spent with NVIDIA, and
Mhm.
then how much of that is leading to actual revenue. Now, I think they're looking at Microsoft revenue, and they talk about Google revenue. They're largely looking at product revenue. They're not really factoring in like cost savings, innovation, productivity. But that all being aside, in essence, it's more of an investing thesis. Like, they're definitely writing this from a VC perspective. And what they're saying is all this money is going into infrastructure, specifically in GPUs to create AI. But where is the end customer value?
Mhm.
So it specifically says how much of the capital expense build out is linked to true end customer demand, and how much of it is being built in anticipation of future end customer demand. This is the $200 billion question. So that was from the original one. And I generally think like that's a valid question. And because we do know, like Tesla, as an example, is buying hundreds of thousands of GPUs, not
Mhm.
for today. Like, it's not generating revenue today. It's to build this vision for robo taxis. So 5 years from now, they're making billions of dollars a year just on the robo taxi. So that's kind of the premise here. OpenAI, Microsoft, they're building massive data centers. They're buying tons of GPUs on the promise of AI. And so it makes a lot of sense, especially under the context of recent conversations we've had around Adept, which just last week we talked about, like, not gone, but basically the teams getting absorbed into Amazon
Mhm.
or AWS. It happened with Inflection, where they'd spent, how many hundreds of $1 millions on GPUs to make no money. And the team basically leaves and goes to Microsoft. And now Inflection's left being whatever it is today. Stability, same thing. So we are certainly seeing hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions, spent on GPUs from NVIDIA that aren't turning in to near-term revenue. It's all being
Mm.
done on this promise of eventual consumer demand. So basically what they're saying in the Sequoia one is we're following the GPUs. Like we're going to find the startups that are building for tomorrow, but are actually solving real world issues, creating real world value. And so they're on a path to try and find these companies that can match their infrastructure investment with a product and a company that is going to actually create end user value. So from that premise, it makes a bunch of sense. Now, the Census Bureau one, this makes for really good headlines. Like, um, I don't know. I was honestly like kind of shocked by this one. So, and we didn't. So this came out in March of 24, but we didn't. It didn't surface for us until we saw it referenced in the Economist article last week. So their basic premise is adoption rates are insanely low. 3.7%, I think, is roughly what they're saying. They talk about, different use cases for marketing automation, virtual assistants. But when I first looked at it, I was like, man, this is a huge sample size. Like
Mhm.
maybe it's Microsoft and LinkedIn and everybody else that's getting it wrong. And the Census Bureau figured this all out. So they say that okay, so 1.2 million employer businesses, so massive. So in the United States, just for context, there's about 24 million businesses, just so people have a general concept here. Um, so they surveyed 164,000 businesses. And it's like, wow, that's the biggest survey size I've ever seen related to AI. So that
Yeah.
like this is worth paying attention to. Then you start digging into the report, and I start realizing like I don't think this report's very valid at all. um, so they said there's an enormous variation in current use by sector from a low of 1.4% in construction and agriculture to a high of 18% in information technology. So, I start really questioning the process here. It's like, okay, I get that you surveyed 164,000 businesses, which is significant, but what did you ask them
Mhm.
to arrive at this, and who answered the question? So, I want to step back and say we're going to talk about this survey for a moment because I think it's important, and it's probably been, mainstream media runs with these headlines. But two, I want this to be a lesson in critically analyzing any research data you see. Like everyone has their own reasons for doing research. And even when we do our own state of marketing AI, we are very clear upfront. This is biased. Like the people answering this are more likely than others to already be adopting AI because they subscribe to the Marketing AI Institute. So it is likely their answers are above the norm. So you have to always analyze how was the survey collected, who answered it, and what did they ask them. And when you go to the what did they ask them, this report immediately starts to sort of lose validity to me. So they asked two core questions of these 164,000 companies, of which I don't even know who they were asking. They specifically at one point said, yeah, some of the people responding are in finance, so they might not know AI within their company. Like, oh,
Mm.
well, that's pretty important. How many of them are the finance people and the HR people? But here's the question. Between month day to month day, so whatever the time period is, did this business use artificial intelligence in producing goods and services? Examples of AI, machine learning, natural language processing, virtual agents, voice recognition, etc. So the first question is, did you use AI to produce goods and services? That's not the same as AI adoption because
Mm.
that is specifically saying, did you make a product or a service with AI? Not saying, are you using it in accounting or using it in HR or are you using it in your marketing? It's saying, are you producing a good or a service with it? So I interpret that to be, is it part of the process to create the good? Um,
Right.
and so I could easily say, well, no, but I'm not sure that you're asking about my marketing because it doesn't say about promoting, planning, performance management. It doesn't say anything. It's just about production of good. So you could already bias this data by people just not being sure what they're asking. The second is you're asking people who don't know what artificial intelligence is. So if you ask a CEO of a farm and ag business, are you using AI? And maybe they don't know, or
Mhm.
you're asking the CFO of a law firm who has heard about it but doesn't really know what it is. So I immediately like, okay, this data is actually kind of useless. Like it's interesting. There's probably something to be learned from it, but because they didn't ask people who necessarily understand what AI is, and they specifically called it production of goods and services, it actually isn't valid to say that the adoption is 1.7%. They don't know.
Yeah.
It's a very narrow, and they even then call out, hey, there's challenges in how we did this based on who answered. Some people are involved in finance and accounting or unfamiliar with technical plans for the company. They actually say the most common challenge presented during cognitive testing surrounded the definition of and what qualifies as AI. Now, I did
Hmm.
not click through and see what the Census Bureau considers AI, but I can tell you if they said they were using it, they then asked 13 follow up questions, of which they said, are you using deep learning, natural language processing, neural networks? Again, do you think the CFO knows what that stuff is?
Right.
So I'll just say that overall, I wouldn't spend time reading this report. I think that it's important to realize that some of us get caught in a bubble of reading the Microsoft LinkedIn data and like we
Mm.
think that that's representative of all companies. That is not true. Somewhere between the Census Bureau data and the tech industry data is probably the reality, but these numbers are, I believe, extremely artificially low to the reality of probably what's going on within the broader industry.
Yeah, the moment I dug into the questions they asked, I immediately had alarm bells going off just
Yep.
because I know if we had asked these questions, for instance, in workshops, consulting engagements, talks that we do, you would get 8 different answers from 8 different people, if depending on their title, where they are in the room, and their understanding.
Yeah, and I think this goes back to my frustration with a lot of research reports, even from some of the big consulting
Yeah,
firms,
yeah, for sure.
where they're asking CEOs sometimes or other C-suite executives about AI, and those people may not be involved in it at all. And so, like, what good is a report about what CEOs think is going to happen over the next 18 months with AI and the impact it's going to have on the workforce if those CEOs don't understand
Mhm.
their own AI strategy or even more broadly all the elements of AI? So again, it's just this is more of a just be cautious, be critical in your thinking when you see research data, especially when you see headlines in mainstream media or Twitter threads that just seem a little bit off, like they usually are. Like there's usually a reason your spidey senses go off that this doesn't seem like viable research that I should base my business decisions on.
So to kind of wrap this up, it sounds like, these reports and these research papers are getting at kind of a broad idea of like, okay, there is a lot of investment that's happening that is not yet seeing immediate returns on the consumer side of the business, but the story is a lot murkier than you might think and a little more nuanced, I would say. Is that accurate?
Definitely. And I think the key takeaway for a lot of listeners here is um, time and time again, we find that people are fearful they've fallen behind, that they're not doing enough with AI in their company, they're not moving fast enough. And what I can tell you is it's more likely than not, that's the norm. So while the Census Bureau's survey, like I think it's ridiculous, like only 1.7% are doing anything with AI. I think it's probably within reason that like 5% or less of companies have an actual AI roadmap, change
Hmm.
management plan, internal academy, AI council, like are really doing it, are really scaling AI. That is a very low percentage based on our experience and conversation. Piloting AI is different. I
Hmm.
think that's a much higher number where people or teams or departments within organizations are experimenting with it, trying to figure it out, testing a technology, testing a few use cases. That is prevalent. Like we have definitely entered the stage where piloting of it and experimenting with it is much more common. It's just often not in some formal structure where the learning is being shared across departments and being pushed up to a council. So piloting AI, I think, is way more prevalent. Scaling AI is still probably much closer to the numbers they're talking about here, where it's truly diffused across all departments and structured in a formal way.